"Choose any bride," the banker laughed. The room filled with cruel chuckles, eyes turning to the mail-order women lined up like cattle. And then came the words no one expected. "Give me the obese mail-order reject," the rancher said. Gasps rippled through the crowd. A woman everyone mocked was suddenly chosen in front of the whole town. But this wasn't just a marriage, it was the start of a battle no one saw coming. Because hidden in her trunk was a letter, proof of a fortune that could bring the banker's empire crashing down. Dust swirls, church bells toll. A barn fire roars in the night. A rancher haunted by loss, a bride scarred by rejection, and a banker willing to burn everything to keep his power. Will this unlikely bride become the heart of a ranch and the downfall of a tyrant? Or will greed and fire destroy the only chance at love they'll ever know? Comment below and tell me where in the world you're joining from. And if this story made you pause for a moment, hit that subscribe button for more. The late afternoon sun slanted through Clear Fork's dusty streets as wagons creaked to a halt outside the weathered brick bank. Children darted between the wooden sidewalks, their excited chatter mixing with the stamp of horses' hooves and the rustle of ladies' skirts. The air hummed with anticipation as townsfolk gathered to witness the arrival of the mail-order brides from back east. Sarah Loudon stood at the edge of the depot platform, her plain brown traveling dress hanging loose on her heavy-set frame. She clutched her worn carpetbag close as if it might shield her from the curious stares and whispered comments. The other brides, slim and pretty in their fashionable clothes, moved away from her like water around a stone. The banker, Mr. Harrison, strutted before them in his tailored suit, every brass button gleaming. His well-oiled mustache twitched as he called out, "Gentlemen, form your line. Come choose your brides." He gestured expansively, playing to the crowd like a carnival barker. Sarah's heart sank as she recognized the familiar pattern. She'd stood on 3 other platforms in 3 other towns, watching hope turn to rejection each time. The first man who'd written to her had taken one look and walked away without a word. The second had laughed outright. The third had at least been polite in his refusal. A ripple of laughter spread through the crowd as Harrison's gaze fell on Sarah. "Well now, looks like we've got ourselves a reject here again." His voice carried clear across the platform. 3 times passed over, ain't that right, Miss Loudon? Sarah's cheeks burned. She stared down at her sturdy boots, wishing the wooden planks beneath her feet would split open and swallow her whole. The other brides tittered behind their gloved hands. Through the blur of her unshed tears, Sarah noticed a pair of worn boots step into view. They belonged to a tall man who moved through the crowd like a shadow, quiet, deliberate. His presence seemed to draw the air from the space around him. "Choose any bride you like," Harrison called out with a theatrical flourish. "Though some might need choosing more than others." Another wave of cruel laughter followed his words. The quiet man's voice cut through the mockery like a blade through butter. "I choose her." The laughter died. Sarah's head snapped up to find a weathered face regarding her steadily. Scars marked his tanned skin, one along his jaw, another disappearing into his hairline. But it was his eyes that held her, dark and serious beneath the brim of his hat. "Her," Harrison sputtered. "Why, that's Sarah Loudon. She's been, I know who she is." The man's voice remained level, but something in his tone made the banker step back. "And I choose her." Sarah could barely breathe as he stepped closer, removing his hat in a fluid motion that spoke of ingrained courtesy. "Gary Hawley, ma'am, would you do me the honor?" He extended his arm to her, as proper as any gentleman in a Boston parlor. With trembling fingers, Sarah placed her hand in the crook of his offered elbow. His sleeve was sun-faded but clean, the muscle beneath solid as iron. She felt the crowd shock like a physical wave as Gary Hawley led her down the platform steps. Whispers followed them down the street. "That's Gary Hawley, lost his wife 5 years back, runs the Double H Ranch. Never thought he'd." Sarah kept her eyes forward, focusing on putting one foot before the other, hardly daring to believe this wasn't some cruel joke that would end in more humiliation. But Gary's stride remained steady, his arm secure beneath her hand as he guided her to the town's boarding house. The proprietor, Mrs. Jensen, showed them to a private dining room where a simple supper waited: beef stew, fresh bread, and coffee in tin cups that caught the last rays of sunlight through the window. They sat across from each other at the small table, the silence between them as heavy as a wool blanket in summer. Sarah stirred her stew, stealing glances at the man who had claimed her so publicly. His movements were efficient as he broke the bread, his scarred hands strong but careful. She noticed he wore no ring. The quiet stretched until Sarah felt she might shatter from the tension. What did he want from her? Why had he chosen her? The questions burned on her tongue, but she held them back, afraid of the answers. Gary set down his spoon and looked at her directly. Reckon we should talk about what happens next. Sarah's hand trembled as she reached for her coffee cup. Yes. Sir, I reckon we should. No need for sir. Gary will do. He paused, considering his words. I've got a ranch 10 miles outside town. It's not fancy, but it's good land. Running about 200 head of cattle. Got a decent house, 2 stories. Needs a woman's touch, truth be told. He spoke matter-of-factly, as if discussing the weather rather than their future. Sarah found herself drawing strength from his straightforward manner. I can cook, she offered quietly, and so. I know how to tend a garden and preserve food for winter. I'm not afraid of hard work. A ghost of a smile touched Gary's lips. Never thought you were, Miss Loudon. Sarah, she corrected softly. I'm to call you Gary. He nodded, and something in his expression eased slightly. Sarah, then. He took a sip of coffee before continuing. I should tell you straight out, I'm not looking for romance. My first wife, Ellen, well, that part of me died with her. What I need is a partner. Someone to help run the ranch, maybe make it a proper home again. If that's not what you're wanting, I'll understand. Sarah felt tears prick her eyes, but this time they weren't from shame. His honesty, however stark, was a gift after so much mockery and rejection. I stopped expecting romance 3 towns ago, Mr. Hawley, Gary. What I want is a place to belong, a purpose, the chance to build something real. Their eyes met across the table, and Sarah saw something shift in his gaze, a recognition, perhaps, of their shared understanding. The silence that fell between them now was different, more comfortable, like the quiet after a storm has passed. Outside. The window, Clear Fork's evening activity continued. Bootsteps on wooden sidewalks, the distant lowing of cattle being driven to night pasture, children's voices calling out as they ran home for supper. But here in this room, something new had taken root. Not love, not yet, but possibility. The chance for 2 wounded souls to find, if not healing, then at least purpose together. Sarah smoothed her skirt and straightened her shoulders, feeling steady for the first time since stepping off the train. Whatever came next, she was ready to face it with the quiet dignity this scarred rancher had shown her. For now, that was enough. Sarah woke before dawn, watching golden light creep across the boarding house wall. She'd barely slept, her mind full of questions about the day ahead. Her valise sat ready by the door, packed with the few possessions she'd carried from town to town. 2 dresses, a worn Bible, and her mother's silver hairbrush. The floorboards creaked as she moved around the small room, smoothing her best traveling dress and pinning her hair neat and tight. Through the window, she could see Clear Fork coming alive, shopkeepers sweeping porches, the smell of fresh bread drifting up from the bakery below. At precisely 7 o'clock, the sound of wagon wheels drew her to the window. Gary Hawley sat straight-backed in the driver's seat, his hat pulled low against the morning sun. Sarah's heart quickened as she lifted her valise and made her way downstairs. Good morning, Miss Loudon, Gary said, touching the brim of his hat. His voice was quiet but carried clearly in the morning air. Several townsfolk had stopped to watch, whispering behind their hands. Good morning, Mr. Hawley. Sarah's voice came out steadier than she felt. She noticed he'd cleaned the wagon bed and laid fresh straw for her trunk. Here, let me help you with that. He took her valise, his movements efficient and courteous. Sarah felt the weight of curious eyes as he helped her up to the wagon seat. Mrs. Jensen, the boarding house owner, stood in the doorway watching with undisguised interest. The wagon lurched forward, wooden wheels clattering on the packed dirt of Main Street. Sarah held tight to the seat, very aware of Gary's solid presence beside her. They passed the bank where she'd stood yesterday, the memory of humiliation still fresh. But today she sat tall, determined to show the watching town her dignity. Once, past the town limits, the prairie opened wide before them. Golden grass rippled in the morning breeze, stretching to the horizon where earth met sky. Sarah had never seen such space, such harsh beauty. It stole her breath for a moment. "It's so vast," she murmured, more to herself than to Gary. "Takes some getting used to," he replied. "Different from back east, I expect." Sarah nodded, gathering her courage to speak again. "Mr. Hawley, Gary, I want to thank you. For yesterday. For choosing me when—" "No need for thanks," he cut in, though his tone remained gentle. "What's done is done. Better we look forward than back." They rode in silence for a while, the steady clip-clop of the horses' hooves marking time. Sarah watched a hawk circle overhead, its wings dark against the morning sky. "I should tell you what to expect," Gary said finally. "Ranch life ain't easy. We work from sunup to sundown most days. Had 200 head of cattle to manage, fences to mend, horses to tend. Winter's coming, and that brings its own trials." "I understand," Sarah said. "I'm not afraid of hard work." Gary glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "No, I don't." "Reckon you are. That's partly why I chose you." He adjusted the reins in his scarred hands. "I don't need a pretty ornament to sit in the parlor. I need a partner, someone who can help keep the ranch alive." The words could have been harsh, but Sarah felt only relief at his honesty. "I can cook for a crew," she offered. "Keep books, tend gardens. I'm good with animals, too." A ghost of a smile touched Gary's lips. "That'll serve you well." Around noon, they stopped at a creek where cottonwoods offered patches of shade. Sarah brought out the biscuits she'd baked that morning, wrapped carefully in a clean cloth. Gary's eyebrows rose slightly as he bit into one. "These are good," he said, surprise evident in his voice. "Thank you." Sarah felt a small warmth of pride. "My mother taught me to bake when I was young. She said good bread could make a meal feel like home." They shared the biscuits with honey from Gary's saddlebag, watching the horses drink from the creek. The day had grown hot, but a breeze carried the scent of sage and distant rain. The afternoon stretched long as they continued their journey. Sarah's muscles ached from the jolting wagon, but she kept her complaints to herself. Gary pointed out landmarks, a lightning-struck oak, a rise of red rocks, the distant smudge of mountains to the west. The sun was setting when Gary finally said, "There it is. Double H Ranch." Sarah leaned forward, taking in her new home. A two-story house stood plain but solid, weathered gray in the evening light. A barn and corral sat off to one side, while a vegetable garden, gone mostly to seed, stretched behind the house. It wasn't grand, but Sarah saw potential in every corner. Two men emerged from the barn as the wagon approached. The older one, lean and weathered, watched Sarah with obvious skepticism. The younger man, Mexican by his features, offered a tentative smile. "Sarah, meet Hank Rollins and Jesse Martinez," Gary said as he helped her down. "They work the ranch." "With me." "Ma'am," Hank said stiffly, touching his hat. Jesse gave a polite nod. "I'm pleased to meet you both," Sarah replied, determined to be gracious despite their obvious reservations. Gary and Ambant. Jesse carried her trunk inside while Hank went to tend the horses. Sarah followed Gary through the house kitchen first with its iron stove and rough wooden table, then the parlor with two worn chairs facing the stone hearth. Upstairs, he showed her to a bedroom with a narrow bed and faded curtains. "It ain't much," Gary said, setting down her trunk. "But it's clean. It's fine," Sarah assured him. And it was. She'd seen far worse in her travels. That evening, after a simple supper of beans and cornbread, Sarah and Gary sat in the parlor. The fire cast dancing shadows on the walls, and through the window she could hear coyotes calling in the distance. The silence between them felt different now, not completely comfortable, but no longer strained with uncertainty. Sarah's hands found her knitting needles, the familiar motion soothing her nerves as she considered her new situation. Gary sat opposite, reading what looked like cattle records by lamplight. Outside, the vast prairie stretched dark and mysterious, but here in this room, Sarah felt the first tentative stirrings of belonging. This was not the romantic future she'd once dreamed of as a young girl. But looking at Gary's serious face in the firelight, she thought perhaps they could build something real here, something based on honest work and mutual respect. For now, that was enough to hope for. Morning sunlight crept through the lace curtains, casting delicate patterns on the worn wooden floor of Gary's ranch house. Sarah stood in the kitchen, having risen well before dawn. The cast iron stove radiated welcome warmth as she worked, her movements sure and practiced despite the unfamiliar space. The sizzle of flapjacks on the griddle filled the kitchen with a homey aroma. Sarah had already mixed the batter, gathered eggs from the henhouse, and set coffee to boil. Her mother's voice echoed in her memory. A good day starts with a proper breakfast. Heavy boots on the porch announced the arrival of the ranch hands. Jesse entered first, removing his hat with a shy "Buenos dias, Senora." Hank followed, his weathered face carefully neutral. Gary came in last, pausing briefly at the sight of his kitchen transformed. "Thought you all might be hungry," Sarah sighed, sliding golden flapjacks onto tin plates. Steam rose from the coffee cup she'd set out, and the eggs waited in a covered skillet to keep warm. Hank studied his plate with suspicion, but at Jesse's appreciative, "Cue Rico." He took a careful bite. His eyebrows rose slightly, and he began eating with more enthusiasm. Gary watched the scene unfold, saying nothing, but Sarah noticed how his eyes tracked between his men's evident enjoyment and her quiet efficiency. After the breakfast dishes were cleared, Gary led Sarah out to the garden patch behind the house. Morning light revealed the neglect. Weeds choked what remained of summer's vegetables, and the fence sagged in places. "Been meaning to tend to it," Gary said, his voice gruff with what might have been embarrassment. "But between the cattle and fence mending," he gestured at the overgrown space, "could use someone who knows about growing things." Sarah was already rolling up her sleeves. "I can help with that." She knelt in the dirt, beginning to pull weeds with determined hands. "Good soil here. With some care, we could have fresh vegetables well into fall, and I can put up preserves for winter." Gary watched her work for a moment. "Much obliged," he said quietly, then turned toward the barn where Jesse was readying horses for the days. Fence check. The morning passed quickly as Sarah attacked the garden's wilderness. She sorted salvageable plants from those too far gone, making mental notes about what seeds to request from the general store. The physical work felt good after days of travel, and she found herself humming hymns as she worked. By noon, she had cleared a significant portion of the garden. The sun rode high and hot when she heard hoofbeats, Gary and Jesse riding out to check the fence lines. Gary raised his hand in greeting as they passed, and Jesse called out a cheerful, "Hasta luego." Sarah turned her attention to the house's interior. Dust had settled thick on windowsills, and corners harbored cobwebs. She found satisfaction in bringing order to each room, continuing to hum as she worked. Amazing grace accompanied the sweep of her broom. "What a friend we have in Jesus," floated through the air as she scrubbed floors. The afternoon light was growing long when she heard horses approaching. Sarah had already started supper, a hearty beef stew simmered on the stove and fresh bread cooled on the kitchen table. The aroma drew Gary and Jesse in like a magnet. "Smells mighty fine," Jesse said, washing up at the pump outside the kitchen door. Gary nodded agreement, his own hands still grimy from fence work. They gathered around the table, the quiet broken only by the clink of spoons against bowls. Sarah had found herself settling into an odd comfort with these silent meals. But tonight, without planning to, she began to sing softly as she cleared the dishes. "Rock of Ages, cleft for me, let me hide myself in thee." The hymn filled the kitchen shadows with gentle notes. Sarah noticed Gary's sudden stillness, saw how his hands tightened on his coffee cup. She finished the verse, letting the last note fade naturally. "Martha used to sing that," Gary said. After a long moment, his voice was rough with memory. "My late wife. She'd sing while she worked, just like—" He didn't finish the sentence, but Sarah saw grief flash across his features, followed by something softer, almost wondering. Jesse quietly excused himself to the barn, leaving Sarah and Gary alone in the lamplit kitchen. Sarah dried her hands on her apron, gathering courage for what she needed to say. "Mr. Hawley, Gary, there's something I should tell you." She reached into her pocket and withdrew a carefully folded letter. "About why I really came west." Gary's expression grew watchful. Sarah smoothed the paper on the table between them. "My father was an investor in Philadelphia," she began. "Before he died, he put significant funds into a banking venture. This letter proves his investment in the Clear Fork Bank and my right to inherit those funds." Gary stiffened, his face going hard as stone. "The Clear Fork Bank? Edmund Morton's bank?" Sarah nodded. The same banker who arranged the mail-order brides. He's been refusing to acknowledge my father's investment or my claim to it. Morton's a powerful man in these parts, Gary said slowly. Controls most of the mortgages hereabouts. Has the ear of the territorial judge. He studied Sarah with new intensity. That why he was so set against you staying in town? Why he tried to shame you in front of everyone? I expect so. Sarah's hands twisted in her apron. I didn't mean to bring trouble to your door, but I couldn't let my father's legacy disappear without a fight. Gary was silent for a long moment, lamplight casting shadows across his scarred face. No, he said finally. Reckon you couldn't. He stood, his chair scraping against the floor. Morton won't take kindly to you pressing your claim. Man like that, he'll do whatever it takes to keep what he thinks is his. Sarah watched anxiety tighten his shoulders as he paced the kitchen. She hadn't wanted to burden this quiet man with her battles, but honesty demanded she tell him the whole truth. Now she could only wait as he absorbed the implications of her revelation. The kitchen grew darker as the lamp burned low, shadows gathering in corners where Sarah had swept away cobwebs just hours before. Outside, a coyote called lonely across the prairie, and somewhere in the barn, a horse stamped restlessly. The peaceful domesticity of their shared meal felt suddenly fragile in the face of the storm. They might be facing. Dawn painted the eastern sky in soft pinks and golds as Gary hitched the wagon horses. Sarah emerged from the house carrying a basket of biscuits wrapped in a clean cloth, her reticule clutched tight in her other hand. The letter nestled inside felt like it weighed 100 pounds. Ready? Gary asked, offering his hand to help her up onto the wagon seat. Sarah nodded, settling her skirts around her. The morning air held autumn's first bite, and she pulled her shawl closer. As they set out, the wagon wheels left twin tracks in the dirt road that stretched toward Clear Fork. Town'll be busy on a Saturday, Gary said after they'd ridden a while. In companionable silence. Market day. I reckon that's good, Sarah replied, though her stomach tightened at the thought of facing so many people. More witnesses if Mr. Morton tries to deny things again. Gary's jaw clenched, but he kept his eyes on the road. The sun climbed higher as they approached town, and Sarah could hear the bustle of market day before they rounded the last bend. Wagons lined the streets, and knots of people gathered on wooden sidewalks. The stares began as soon as they entered town. Sarah felt them like physical touches, women pausing in their shopping to whisper behind raised hands, men nudging each other and smirking. She held her head high, though her cheeks burned. Pay them no mind, Gary murmured as he helped her down from the wagon in front of Jensen's General Store. The bell above the door announced their entrance with a cheerful jingle that seemed at odds with the sudden hush that fell over the other customers. Mrs. Jensen, arranging fabric bolts behind the counter, gave them a curious look. Morning, Mr. Holla. Ma'am. Morning, Gary replied, pulling his list from his pocket. Need some supplies. Sarah followed him down the narrow aisles, trying to ignore the whispers that seemed to chase them like shadows. Can't believe he chose her. Mail order reject. Must be desperate. Gary's shoulders grew more rigid with each comment, but he continued selecting items from his list. Coffee, sugar, salt, ammunition, nails. Sarah added garden seeds to their purchases, focusing on the familiar task rather than the judgment surrounding them. The bell jingled again, and Sarah's heart stumbled as Edmund Morton's well-fed frame filled the doorway. The banker's eyebrows rose in elaborate surprise. Well, if it isn't the happy couple, he said, his voice carrying clearly through the store. How unexpected to see you here. Sarah's fingers found the reticule where her father's letter lay hidden. Mr. Morton, she said, proud that her voice remained steady. I'm glad to have this chance to speak with you about my father's investment. The store grew absolutely silent. Morton's face hardened, though his smile remained fixed. My dear woman, surely you're not still clinging to that fantasy. It's no fantasy, sir. Sarah withdrew the letter, her hands trembling slightly. I have proof of my father's partnership in your bank. His investment should have passed to me upon his death. Morton laughed, the sound sharp and dismissive. A letter? That's your proof? He turned to address the watching crowd. Ladies and gentlemen, witness how desperate some people become. Making outrageous claims, trying to stake a claim on what isn't theirs. His voice dripped with mock sympathy. I suppose being rejected so many times can unhinge a person's mind. Titters of laughter rippled through the store. Sarah felt the blood drain from her face as Morton continued. I knew your father, Miss Loudon. A foolish man who lost his money in poor investments. Whatever papers you think you have are worthless. Gary's hand closed gentle but firm around Sarah's elbow. Time we were going, he said, his quiet voice carrying steel. He settled their account with Mrs. Jensen while Sarah stood frozen, Morton's words echoing in her ears. The wagon ride home passed in heavy silence. The sun had passed its peak when they pulled into the ranch yard, and Sarah's eyes burned with unshed tears. Gary helped her down, his touch careful. I'm sorry, she whispered once they were inside. What if he's right? What if Father's papers aren't enough? The fears that had been building all day spilled out. I've brought nothing but trouble and shame to your door. Gary set down the supplies and turned to face her. Now you listen here, he said firmly. That banker's a snake, and we both know it. Your father's letter is real enough. Morton's reaction proves that. Man wouldn't get so riled about worthless paper. His words steadied her, though doubt still gnawed at her heart. She busied herself putting away the supplies, trying to find comfort in the familiar task. When Hank and Jessie came in for supper, their usual easy manner seemed strained. Heard some talk in town today, Hank said finally, pushing beans around his plate. Don't put stock in it, ma'am. Folks round here, they don't know nothing. Jessie nodded vigorous agreement. He's verdad. They are foolish people who cannot see what is in front of them. Sarah's eyes filled with grateful tears at their awkward defense. Thank you, she managed. That means more than you know. After the meal, Gary settled in his chair by the fire to mend tack, the leather creaking softly as he worked. The lamp cast warm light across his scarred hands as they moved with practiced skill over the worn bridle. Sarah sat at the kitchen table, her father's letter spread before her. But instead of reading it again, she folded her hands and bowed her head. The familiar words of prayer came easier here in the quiet evening than they had in the harsh light of day. Lord, she whispered, give me strength to face whatever comes. And thank you for sending me to these good people. The soft scratch of Gary's work and the cricket song drifting through the open window wrapped around her like a blanket. Her resolve, shaken by Morton's public humiliation, steadied in the peace of this moment. Whatever battles lay ahead, she was no longer facing them alone. The morning sun rose harsh and unforgiving over the ranch, bringing with it a dry wind that kicked up clouds of dust across the yard. Sarah stood at the kitchen window, watching golden particles dance in the early light while she wrapped the last biscuit in a clean cloth. The corral needed mending, and she'd insisted on helping despite Gary's initial hesitation. Outside, the wind tugged at her skirts as she carried breakfast to the men. Gary and Jessie were already examining the broken corral sections, while Hank sorted through timber they'd hauled in the previous evening. Best eat first, Gary said, nodding toward the food. Going to be a long morning. They settled on upturned buckets, the smell of coffee mixing with sage on the breeze. Sarah watched the men eat, noting how they'd stopped watching her so rarely these past few days. Progress, however small, was still progress. Reckon we should start with the north corner, Gary said, brushing crumbs from his shirt. Sarah, I can help carry posts, she interrupted firmly. I'm stronger than I look. Gary studied her for a moment, then nodded. All right then. The work was harder than Sarah had expected, but she gritted her teeth and matched the men's pace. Her arms trembled as she helped Jessie position a heavy post, sweat darkening her collar despite the morning hour. Dust caked her face and hands, but she didn't stop. Hold it steady now, Gary called, tamping dirt around the base. Sarah's muscles burned, but she didn't waver. The sun climbed higher, beating down mercilessly. Sarah passed tools, hauled lumber, and held posts in place without complaint. Her back ached fiercely, but there was satisfaction in seeing the corral take shape under their hands. By noon, they'd replaced most of the damaged sections. Jessie wiped his brow with a bandana, giving Sarah an appraising look. You're tougher than we figured, Signora. Most city women wouldn't last an hour at this work. Sarah's face glowed with more than just sun and effort. Much obliged, Jessie. I aim to pull my weight around here. You're doing fine, Gary said quietly, and though his words were simple, They warmed her heart more than any elaborate praise could have. They were washing up for the midday meal when hoofbeats announced a visitor. Reverend Thompson rode up in his black buggy, his collar wilting slightly in the heat. Sarah hurried to greet him, conscious of her dusty appearance. "Good day to you all," the preacher said, climbing down. He carried a small package wrapped in brown paper. "Thought I'd stop by and offer my congratulations to the newlyweds. Brought you something too." Inside the house, Sarah served coffee while the Reverend unwrapped his gift, a leather-bound Bible with both their names tooled on the cover. "Every home needs the good book," he said, smiling kindly. Sarah's fingers traced the letters of their names. "It's beautiful, Reverend. Thank you." She hesitated, then reached for her reticule. "Since you're here, there's something I'd like to show you." She explained about her father's letter while Gary listened from his place by the window. The preacher examined the document carefully, his expression thoughtful. "This is quite serious," he said finally. "If what this letter states is true, Mr. Morton has some explaining to do. I can help you look through the county records, see if there's any official documentation of the partnership. Would you?" Sarah's voice caught. "We'd be so grateful." "Of course, my dear. It's a matter of justice, after all." The Reverend's kind eyes crinkled. "The Lord sees all truth, even when men try to hide it." The afternoon brought more visitors, neighbors whose curiosity finally overcame their restraint. They arrived in twos and threes, some bearing welcome gifts of preserves or bread, others empty-handed but full of questions. Sarah greeted each one graciously, though she felt their scrutiny like a physical weight. Mrs. Peterson brought peach preserves and careful compliments about the swept porch. The Wilson sisters presented a loaf of sourdough while their eyes darted around the clean kitchen. Old Mr. Jenkins didn't bring anything except his sharp observations about mail-order women and proper ranch wives. Through it all, Sarah kept her spine straight and her voice steady, serving coffee and answering questions about her Eastern background. But she heard the whispers, saw the sidelong glances. "Rather plain, isn't she? Can she really manage a ranch this size? Poor Gary. Must have been desperate." Each comment stung, but Sarah kept serving coffee and maintaining conversation. She spoke of her gardening plans, her experience with household management, careful to keep her voice even when Mrs. Drake asked pointedly about her unusual situation with the banker. The sun was setting when the last wagon pulled away, leaving blessed quiet in its wake. Sarah stood in the kitchen, her shoulders finally slumping as she began to scrub the coffee cups and plates. "You did fine," Gary said from the doorway, his voice carrying the same quiet authority it had held all day. "Better than fine." Sarah's hand stilled in the dishwater. "Did I? They all think you made a terrible mistake." "Don't much care what they think." Gary stepped into the kitchen, his boots scuffing the clean floor. "I know what I see." "And what's that?" Sarah asked, not turning around, afraid her face would reveal too much hope. A woman who worked alongside men all morning without complaint, who greeted every nosy neighbor with grace. "Who's planning to fight a corrupt banker with nothing but truth and courage?" He paused. "Seems to me that's exactly what this ranch needs." Sarah's hands moved over the pans again, but her heart felt lighter. Through the window, she could see the repaired corral standing sturdy against the darkening sky. One day's work, visible and solid. Perhaps that's how she would build her place here, one day. One task, one small victory at a time. Gary remained in the doorway, watching her work. The lamplight caught the strong lines of her arms as she scrubbed, the determined set of her shoulders. If his gaze lingered, it wasn't on her size but on the quiet strength she'd shown all day. The kitchen grew dim as night crept in, but Sarah kept working, each clean pan a small triumph, each moment under Gary's steady gaze another foundation stone in the life they were beginning to build. The next week settled into a steady rhythm at the Hawley Ranch. Each dawn painted the sky in streaks of pink and gold, calling everyone to their duties. Gary and the hands rode out early, checking cattle and mending the endless miles of fence that stretched across the property. Sarah rose before them all, filling the kitchen with the scent of coffee and fresh biscuits. Her garden flourished under careful tending. She spent hours pulling weeds, watering seedlings, and planning what to plant next. The ranch hand stopped teasing about her fancy Eastern ways when fresh vegetables started appearing on their plates each evening. supper time became a quiet pleasure. Gary would lean back in his chair, plate empty, and nod his appreciation. Sarah learned to read his silences, the tired ones, the contemplative ones, and sometimes the almost comfortable ones. She sang while she washed dishes, her voice carrying hymns into the evening air. That peaceful pattern broke on Friday evening. Hoofbeats thundered into the yard just as Sarah was setting out supper. Gary opened the door to find young Tommy Wilson, the telegraph operator's son, clutching a yellow paper. "Pa said to bring this right away, Mr. Hawley," Tommy panted, holding out the telegram. "Said it was urgent like." Gary's face darkened as he read. His jaw tightened and the paper crumpled slightly in his grip. Sarah watched from the doorway, her heart sinking before he even spoke. "Banker Morton's gone to Judge Parker," Gary said finally, his voice low and controlled. "Claims your inheritance letter is fraudulent. Wants the matter settled in court next week." Sarah's hands twisted in her apron, but her voice remained steady. "Well then, we'll just have to prove him wrong. The proper way, mind you." Gary's fists clenched. "Proper way? That snake's trying to cheat you out of what's rightfully yours." "And we'll fight him fair," Sarah insisted. She stepped closer, touching his arm lightly. "Violence won't prove anything. We have truth on our side. That's worth more than fists." Gary looked down at her hand on his arm, his tension slowly easing. "You sound mighty sure about that." "I am." Sarah straightened her shoulders. "The Lord sees all truth, even when men try to hide it, remember?" The next morning, Reverend Thompson rode up in his buggy, his face creased with concern. He'd heard about Morton's petition and came straight out to offer help. "I'll go with you both to town," he said, accepting a cup of coffee from Sarah. "Morton needs to understand this isn't just going away. The community's watching now." "Much obliged, Reverend," Gary said. "We could use a friend in town about now." Sunday dawned clear and bright. Sarah stood before her mirror, smoothing her best dress with trembling hands. It would be her first time attending church in Clear Fork, and her stomach churned at that thought of all those eyes upon her. Gary waited by the wagon, dressed in his good suit. He helped Sarah up onto the seat, his hand steady and warm. The ride to town was quiet, broken only by the creak of wheels and the jingle of harness. Clear Fork's little white church stood proud against the morning sky. Sarah's heart pounded as Gary helped her down from the wagon. Townsfolk were already gathering, their Sunday best bright in the sunshine. She felt their stares as she walked toward the church steps. Mrs. Peterson nodded politely. The Wilson sisters whispered behind their hands. But Reverend Thompson stood at the door, welcoming them warmly. Come in," he smiled. "We're blessed to have you join us today." Sarah slipped into a pew beside Gary, trying to make herself smaller as more people filed in. The familiar sense of beeswax and hymnals calmed her somewhat. When the organ wheezed to life, she opened her book to the marked page. The first hymn was Amazing Grace. Sarah knew it by heart. Without thinking, she lifted her voice in song. Clear and true, it rose above the congregation, filling the small church with unexpected beauty. Heads turned. The whispering stopped. Her voice soared into the rafters, carrying years of faith and hope in every note. She sang of grace and salvation, of being lost and found, and in those moments she forgot to be afraid. She was just a soul-lifting praise, as natural as breathing. When the hymn ended, there was a moment of profound silence before the service continued. Sarah felt Gary's gaze on her, but she kept her eyes forward, her cheeks warm. After the final blessing, people who had previously avoided her now came forward. Mrs. Peterson clasped her hand, eyes warm with approval. "What a gift you have, my dear. You must join our choir." Even the Wilson sisters approached, their earlier disdain replaced by genuine smiles. "We had no idea you could sing like that," Martha Wilson said. "Simply beautiful." The ride home was quiet again, but differently so. Sarah felt lighter somehow, as if she'd left some of her burden of judgment back in that sunlit church. The afternoon passed peacefully. With Gary reading his newspaper while Sarah prepared their Sunday dinner. It wasn't until evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky, that Gary finally spoke of it. "That hymn today," he said softly, his eyes on the distant hills. "Rebecca used to sing it just like that. Same part and everything." Sarah's heart caught at the mention of his late wife. She waited, barely breathing as he continued. Hadn't heard. It sung proper since she passed. Didn't think I ever wanted to again. He turned to look at her then, his face softened by memory and something else, something new. But today, it was right somehow, like hearing it fresh. I'm sorry if it brought pain, Sarah whispered. No, Gary shook his head. It brought something else. Something I thought was gone for good. He cleared his throat roughly. Reckon that's worth something. Sarah sat very still, her heart full of aching hope. The evening crickets began their song as the sky deepened to purple. Neither spoke again, but the silence between them had changed, like the first subtle shift of winter into spring, promising something new might grow. The morning dawned cool and misty as Gary and Sarah prepared for their journey to the county seat. Sarah stood at the stove, frying eggs and brewing coffee with hands that wouldn't quite stay steady. She'd barely slept, her mind churning with worry about the hearing ahead. Gary entered the kitchen, his boots heavy on the wooden floor. He'd already hitched the team to the wagon and loaded their supplies for the overnight stay. Best eat hearty, he said, settling at the table. Long ride ahead. Sarah nodded, setting his plate before him. The eggs steamed in the morning air, but she could hardly manage more than a few bites of her own. Her father's documents lay carefully wrapped in oilcloth, tucked safely in her traveling bag. Every piece of paper felt precious as gold. The sun was just climbing over the eastern hills when they set out. The wagon creaked and swayed over the rutted road, wheels throwing up dust that settled on their clothes. Sarah clutched her reticule, close, feeling the precious papers inside. Gary handled the reins with quiet competence, guiding the horses around the worst of the holes and washouts. They stopped at noon to rest the horses and eat the bread and cheese Sarah had packed. The shade of a lone cottonwood offered brief respite from the sun. Sarah smoothed her skirts, brushing away dust. You holding up all right? Gary asked, passing her the canteen. Yes, thank you. She took a careful sip. I just keep thinking about facing that banker again. Morton's all bluster, Gary said firmly. Truth's worth more than his fancy talk. The afternoon stretched long as they continued their journey. Sarah's back ached from the constant jostling, but she kept her spine straight, determined not to complain. Gary occasionally pointed out landmarks, an old buffalo wallow, the skeleton of a fallen tree struck by lightning, the distant smudge of smoke that marked the county seat. They reached town as shadows lengthened across the packed dirt streets. The courthouse loomed ahead, its brick facade stern and imposing. Gary helped Sarah down from the wagon, his hand steady beneath her elbow. We've got time to get settled at the boarding house before dark, he said. Hearing's not till morning. Mrs. Peterson's boarding house sat just off the main street, its white-painted trim neat despite the dusty air. The proprietor showed them to separate rooms, her eyes curious but kind. Sarah spent the evening reviewing her father's papers one last time, whispering prayers into the growing darkness. Morning brought clear skies and the weight of anticipation. Sarah dressed carefully in her best dress, securing her hair neatly beneath her hat. Her hands trembled as she pinned it in place, but she forced them steady. When she descended the stairs, she found Gary waiting in his good suit, his usual work-worn hat replaced by a clean one. The courthouse was already busy when they arrived, full of morning business and curious onlookers. Sarah's shoes clicked against the wooden floor as they made their way to the courtroom. Banker Morton stood near the judge's bench, looking sleek and confident in his fine suit. His smirk when he saw them made Sarah's stomach clench. Judge Parker called the hearing to order, his gavel sharp in the hushed room. Sarah stepped forward when beckoned, her voice surprisingly clear as she presented her father's documents. The ledgers showed clear records of investment. The letters detailed agreements. The contract bore proper signatures and notary seals. These papers prove my father's investment in Mr. Morton's bank, Sarah explained. $5,000 properly documented and witnessed. Morton's laugh cut through the air. Forgeries, Your Honor. Clever ones, but false nonetheless. This woman is trying to claim money that doesn't exist. Sarah's cheeks burned, but she kept her chin high. Judge Parker adjusted his spectacles, examining each document with careful attention. The silence stretched thin as spider silk while he read. Finally, the judge looked up. These documents appear properly executed, he said slowly. However, Given the serious nature of the claims and counterclaims, I must send to Denver for verification of the records. This will take some weeks. Sarah felt the words like a physical blow. Weeks of waiting, of uncertainty, of Morton's sneering presence in town. Gary's hand found her elbow, steadying her. The court will notify all parties when the verification arrives, Judge Parker concluded. Until then, these documents remain in the court's custody. Outside the courthouse, Sarah's composure finally cracked. Weeks, she whispered. How can we wait so long? Truth takes its own time, Gary said quietly, but it always comes out. They walked slowly back to the boarding house, dust settling on their good clothes. The dining room was half full when they went down to supper, and Sarah felt the weight of curious stares. Whispers followed them to their corner table. Did you see her in court? Morton says it's all false. That rancher must be addled, taking up with her. Sarah pushed her food around her plate, appetite gone. Gary ate methodically, his expression giving nothing away. When she could bear the whispers no longer, Sarah excused herself to her room. Alone in the narrow chamber, she sank to her knees beside the bed. Lord, give me strength, she whispered. Help me hold fast to truth. Her father's face rose in her memory. His kind eyes, his careful handling of business papers, his absolute honesty in all dealings. He would never have forged documents. Never. In the hallway outside her room, Gary stood with one hand pressed against her door, listening to her quiet prayers. His heart ached with an unfamiliar mixture of feelings. Admiration for her quiet strength, anger at Morton's smug certainty, and fear that this fight might break them both. He'd grown used to her presence at the ranch, her hymns floating through the evening air, her steady way of handling whatever work came before her. More than that, he'd begun to feel something he thought had died with Rebecca, a warmth in his chest when Sarah smiled, a lightness when she sang. But now Morton threatened everything, and Gary felt helpless to stop it. He wanted to burst into the banker's office and demand justice, but Sarah's insistence on doing things properly held him back. His knuckles whitened against the doorframe. The sound of Sarah's prayers drifted through the wood, soft but unwavering. Finally, Gary turned away, his boots quiet on the carpeted hall floor. Whatever came, they would face it together. Truth and time would tell the rest. The journey back to the ranch took a full day, the wagon wheels kicking up dust along the sun-baked road. By the time they arrived, both Sarah and Gary felt the weight of waiting settle heavily on their shoulders. But ranch work waited for no one, and the next morning dawned with chores demanding attention. Sarah rose before sunrise, determined to keep her hands busy. The garden needed tending, and the late summer vegetables were coming in strong. She spent hours harvesting tomatoes and green beans, the morning sun beating down on her back as she worked. The familiar rhythm of picking and sorting helped quiet her worried thoughts. As days passed, the heat grew more intense. Gary and the hands rode out early to check the water holes, returning with grim reports. The wells were dropping lower, and cattle clustered around the remaining water sources, trampling the banks. One afternoon, while Sarah stood at the kitchen table slicing tomatoes for canning, she heard horses approaching. Through the window, she spotted two riders wearing the banker's brand. They sat tall in their saddles, dust coating their clothes as they spoke with Gary near the corral. Ain't your business how we run things. Gary's voice carried clearly across the yard. The taller rider leaned forward. Morton says you'll all lose everything when the water gives out. Better sell while you can still get a fair price. Sarah's hand stilled on the tomatoes, listening. Gary's response was too quiet to hear, but the set of his shoulders told her. Plenty. The riders finally turned their horses, but not before casting long looks at the struggling pastures. That evening, Sarah worked later than usual, determined to preserve every bit of the garden's bounty. Jars of tomatoes and pickled vegetables lined the shelves, a hedge against harder times. She mended shirts by lamplight, making each stitch count, while Gary sat nearby cleaning his rifle. They've been to every ranch in the valley, he said finally, breaking the silence, trying to frighten folks into selling. Sarah threaded her needle carefully. We won't let them win. The next morning brought news that the Wilson place, 3 miles east, had sold to the bank. Sarah saw how the news hit Gary, though he said nothing. She threw herself into her work with renewed determination. scrubbing floors until they shone and baking extra bread to share with worried neighbors. 4 days later, as the sun began its descent, Hank burst into the kitchen. "Got a breech berth out in the north pasture," he announced, breathing hard. "Heifer's in trouble." Sarah grabbed her apron and followed without hesitation. She'd helped with difficult births back east on her uncle's farm. The men exchanged glances as she hurried alongside them to the corral, but no one protested. The heifer lay straining in the dust, her sides heaving. Sarah knelt beside her, murmuring softly, "There now, girl. Easy does it." Her hands moved with gentle confidence as she checked the calf's position. "Lord, guide these hands," she prayed quietly, rolling up her sleeves. For the next hour, she worked steadily, directing the men's help when needed. Her prayers continued, a steady stream of comfort for both the laboring heifer and herself. Finally, with a last mighty effort, the calf slid free. Sarah cleared its nose and mouth, rubbing it briskly until it took its first shuddering breath. The heifer began licking her baby clean, and Sarah sat back on her heels, exhausted but smiling. Hank stared at her with new respect. "Well, I'll be," he muttered, loud enough for all to hear. "You're worth 10 of us, Mrs. Hawley." Sarah blushed at the praise, but her eyes shone with quiet pride. Gary helped her to her feet, his hand lingering on her elbow longer than strictly necessary. The touch sent warmth through her despite her weariness. That evening, after washing up and changing her soiled dress, Sarah served a simple supper of beans and cornbread. The men's attitudes had shifted subtly. They passed dishes with newfound respect, and even Jessie, usually so quiet, spoke up to describe her calm handling of the birth to Gary. Later, as purple dusk settled over the ranch, Sarah stepped out onto the porch. The air felt heavy with approaching rain, and far-off lightning flickered on the horizon. She began humming softly, an old hymn her mother had loved. The porch boards creaked behind her. Gary stepped up beside her, his presence solid and familiar. Now, they stood in comfortable silence, watching the distant storm build. "Haven't prayed in years," Gary said finally, his voice rough with emotion. "Not since Rebecca passed. Felt like God wasn't listening anymore." Sarah's heart ached for his loss. "But now?" she asked softly. "Been trying again," he admitted. "Watching you, your faith through all this, makes me wonder if I gave up too easy." Sarah's hand moved of its own accord, settling gently over his, where it rested on the porch railing. The touch was light but filled with understanding. Gary's fingers twitched, then slowly turned to clasp hers. They stood together, watching heat lightning dance across the clouds. The moment stretched between them, delicate as spider silk but strong as steel wire. The air grew thick with promise, both from the approaching storm and something deeper stirring between them. Thunder rolled in the distance, breaking the silence. The first cool breeze in days swept across the porch, carrying the sweet scent of rain. Sarah's hymn had faded, but the quiet between them felt like its own kind of music. The storm drew closer, but neither moved to go inside. Gary's hand remained warm beneath hers, and Sarah felt hope rising like the wind. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, strengthened by newfound trust and the first tender shoots of something more. The drought tightened its grip on Clear Fork Valley like a fist. Weeks crawled by, each day hotter than the last. The land turned brittle, creek beds cracked, and dust crept into every corner of the ranch house no matter how often Sarah swept. She wiped down the kitchen table for the third time that morning, her cloth coming away brown. The air felt thick, making even simple tasks harder. Outside, the garden struggled despite her careful tending. Only the hardiest plants survived, their leaves dusty and curled. "Heading to town," Gary announced from the doorway. "Need supplies." He hesitated, then added, "Could use your help with the list." Sarah nodded, grateful for the chance to leave the house. Within minutes, she changed into her best dress and pinned up her hair. The wagon creaked under their weight as Gary helped her up to the seat. The ride was quiet, both lost in thought as they passed neighboring ranches. Fences sagged, cattle looked thin, and worried faces watched them pass. The drought had everyone on edge. Clear Fork's main street stirred with morning activity when they arrived. Gary tied the horses while Sarah straightened her skirts, holding her head high despite the stares. They hadn't been to town together since the courthouse hearing. Weeks ago. Outside the general store, A cluster of men lounged against the wall. Their whispers carried clearly in the still air. "Reckon Hale's got himself a fine workhorse now," one sneered. Cruel laughter followed. Another voice added, "Heard she eats more than she works." Sarah's cheeks burned, but she kept walking, dignity wrapped around her like armor. Gary's jaw tightened, but she touched his arm gently. "They're not worth the trouble," she murmured. Inside the store, Sarah consulted her list while Gary loaded sacks of flour and sugar into their wagon. The shopkeeper's wife watched them with poorly hidden curiosity. "Mail's come," she announced, suddenly reaching beneath the counter. "Letter here from Mrs. Hawley." Sarah's hands trembled as she recognized the Denver postmark. She broke the seal right there, unable to wait. Gary moved closer, steadying her elbow as she read. "It's true," she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. "The Denver office confirms everything. Father's investment, the contracts, all of it." Her voice grew stronger. "They found his original ledgers in their archives." Gary squeezed her shoulder, his touch warm and sure. "Never doubted you." The shopkeeper's wife leaned forward, eager for details, but Sarah carefully folded the letter into her reticule. They finished their purchases in charged silence, aware that news would spread fast in a town this size. Before they left, the telegraph operator hurried over with another message. The judge had set their final hearing for the following week. Sarah's heart soared. At last, the waiting would end. The ride home felt lighter despite the oppressive heat. Even the horses seemed to sense the shift, their pace quickening as they neared the ranch. Sarah found herself humming, an old hymn of Thanksgiving rising naturally to her lips. That evening, she poured her heart into preparing a celebration supper. The kitchen filled with savory smells as she simmered her best beef stew, adding extra potatoes and the last of her precious dried herbs. She even broke out the special flour she'd been saving to bake a batch of sweet biscuits. Hank and Jesse cleaned up special for the meal, their faces shining from hard scrubbing. They'd grown protective of Sarah over the weeks, and her victory felt like their own. Even young Billy, who helped with the horses, joined them at the table. Sarah served the stew in their best bowls, the ones she'd carefully wrapped in her trunk all the way from back east. Steam rose in the lamplight as Gary said grace, his voice rough with emotion. "Lord, we thank you for this food, for justice done, and for bringing new light to this home." The meal that followed was unlike any they'd shared before. Stories flowed as freely as the coffee, and laughter, real, unburdened laughter, rang out again and again. Jesse told tales of his first cattle drive, while Hank recalled the early days of Clear Fork with surprising humor. Sarah started them singing after the dishes were cleared. First the familiar hymns, then the livelier songs everyone knew. Even Gary joined in, his deep voice blending with hers on Amazing Grace. The hands drifted off to the bunkhouse as evening deepened, leaving Sarah and Gary alone. The kitchen was quiet now, but it held the warmth of their celebration like banked coals. "Reckon we should get some rest," Gary said finally, but he made no move to rise from his chair. Sarah nodded, though she wasn't ready for the evening to end. "I'll just step out for some air first." The porch welcomed her with familiar creaks. Stars pierced the velvet sky, and a slight breeze stirred, the first she'd felt in days. She breathed deeply, tasting dust but also something fresher, like promise. Gary's steps followed her out. He settled beside her at the railing, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. The silence between them felt different now, charged with things unsaid. "Been meaning to tell you something," he said finally, his voice low and careful. "After Rebecca died, I shut everything down. Didn't just stop praying, stopped living, really. Just existed, doing what needed doing." He paused, searching for words. Ranch was dark, empty. Didn't think it would ever be different. Sarah held perfectly still, hardly daring to breathe. Gary turned to face her, his expression vulnerable in the starlight. "But you brought light back," he continued softly. "Not just to the house, to everything. Way you work so hard, keep your faith no matter what folks say. How you sing them hymns like you mean every word." His voice roughened. "Made me remember there's more to life than just surviving." Sarah's heart thundered in her chest. Slowly, carefully, she reached out and covered his hand with hers where it rested on the railing. His fingers were rough with calluses, but they trembled slightly at her touch. "Thank you," she whispered, her own voice unsteady. For believing in me when nobody else would. Their fingers intertwined naturally, the simple touch more intimate than any words. Sarah felt the connection between them pulse like a living thing, tender, precious, and new. They stood together in the starlight, watching the night deepen over their land. The drought still held the valley in its grip, but change was coming. Sarah could feel it in the air, in Gary's warm hand holding hers, in the way hope had taken root and begun to flower despite the dust. Dawn painted the sky in gentle pinks and golds as Sarah and Gary's wagon rattled toward Clear Fork. The morning air held a hint of autumn Christmas, promising change. Sarah smoothed her best dress, the blue calico she'd saved for special occasions, and touched the letter from Denver tucked safely in her reticule. Ready? Gary asked quietly as they approached the courthouse. His Sunday suit looked stiff and uncomfortable, but his eyes held steady confidence. Sarah nodded, though butterflies danced in her stomach. Ready as I'll ever be. Already, townsfolk gathered on the courthouse steps, their whispers rising like rustling leaves. Some nodded respectfully as Gary helped Sarah down from the wagon. Others turned away, loyalty to the banker evident in their cold shoulders. Inside, the courtroom's wooden benches creaked under the weight of spectators. The banker sat near the front, his expensive suit a stark contrast to the working folks' attire. His face wore a practiced mask of indifference, but his fingers drummed restlessly on the table before him. The judge entered, and everyone rose. Sarah's heart pounded as she watched him settle behind his desk, pulling out papers with deliberate care. The room fell silent, waiting. Having reviewed the documentation from the Denver office, the judge began, his voice carrying to every corner. I find the evidence conclusive. He held up the letter that had arrived by post. Records confirm that Jonathan Loudon invested a considerable sum in Mr. Crawford's banking enterprise. The contracts were properly executed and witnessed. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Sarah felt Gary's hand slip into hers, warm and reassuring. Furthermore, the judge continued, as Mr. Loudon's sole heir, Miss Sarah Loudon, now Mrs. Hale, is entitled to her father's full share of the enterprise, including all accrued interest and profits. He fixed the banker with a stern gaze. The court orders immediate payment of funds to be completed within 30 days. The banker surged to his feet, face flushing dark red. This is outrageous. I'll appeal. You'll do no such thing, the judge cut in sharply. The evidence is clear. Pay what you owe, Mr. Crawford, or face contempt charges. The gavel cracked down with finality. Cheers erupted from several benches. Sarah recognized faces that had scorned her weeks ago, now smiling and nodding. The banker stormed out, shoving past well-wishers who surrounded Sarah and Gary. Never doubted. You, Mrs. Hawley, the general store owner's wife called out. Showed him proper, you did, added old Mr. Jensen, who ran the livery. They emerged into bright sunlight where more townspeople waited. Sarah felt dizzy with relief and joy. Gary's arm, steady around her waist, guiding her through the crowd to their wagon. This ain't over, the banker's voice rang out from the street. He stood by his office, face twisted with rage. You'll regret this day, all of you. Gary's jaw tightened, but Sarah squeezed his hand. Let's go home, she whispered. He's not. Worth another moment. The ride home was pure celebration. Sarah couldn't stop smiling, and even Gary's usual reserve melted into quiet contentment. They spoke of plans repairs for the ranch house, new cattle to build their herd, perhaps even a proper piano for the parlor. As they approached their land, Sarah gasped in delight. Wagons lined the drive and neighbors stood waiting with covered dishes and bright faces. Thought we'd have ourselves a little celebration, called Mrs. Peterson, holding up a fresh-baked apple pie. The afternoon flowed like honey, sweet and warm. Women crowded Sarah's kitchen, sharing recipes and stories. Men gathered on the porch, discussing rainfall and cattle prices with new respect in their voices when they addressed Gary. Children played tag in the yard while young Billy proudly showed off the new calf to visitors. Sarah moved through it all in a happy daze, accepting hugs and congratulations. Her heart swelled when she overheard Mrs. Peterson tell another woman, always knew she was quality, right from the start. As sunset painted the sky in fierce oranges, folks began heading home. Sarah hummed while she put away dishes and leftover food. joy bubbling up inside her like a spring. Gary found her in the kitchen after the last guests left. He stood in the doorway, watching her work with an expression she'd never seen before, something tender and wondering. "Never thought I'd see this place full of life again," he said softly. Sarah smiled, understanding all he left unsaid. "God has a way of surprising us, that he does." Gary stepped closer, reaching for her hand. "Reckon he knew what he was about, sending you here." The moment hung between them, rich with possibility. But before either could speak again, hoofbeats thundered in the distance. Gary tensed, moving to the window. "Riders coming, fast." His voice sharpened with alarm. "Sarah, get the men now." She ran for the bunkhouse, heart racing. Through the gathering darkness, she glimpsed multiple riders approaching, something bright in their hands, torches. "Fire!" Gary's shout split the night. "They're heading for the barn." Horror froze Sarah for a heartbeat as the first torch arced through the air, landing on the barn's roof. Flames caught quickly in the dry wood and hay. The household erupted into desperate action. Hank and Jesse sprinted from the bunkhouse, Billy close behind. Gary was already running for the barn doors, throwing them wide to reach the panicked animals within. "The horses!" Sarah found her voice, running to help. Smoke billowed thick and black, stinging her eyes. She could hear the cattle bellowing. In terror, they worked frantically in the growing inferno. Gary and Jesse led horses out while Hank and Billy tried to herd cattle through the doors. Sarah grabbed buckets, organizing a water line from the well, but the flames spread too fast. A massive crack split the air. "Get back!" Gary bellowed, grabbing Sarah and Billy, yanking them away as part of the roof collapsed inward. Sparks showered down like deadly stars. They could only watch helpless as the fire devoured their barn. The heat pushed them further back. Sarah's face wet with tears as she counted the animals they'd managed to save, and those they hadn't. It felt like hours before the flames began to die, leaving nothing but smoking ruins. The pre-dawn air grew thick with ash and the acrid smell of burned wood. Gary stood amid the destruction, his face carved from stone. Soot streaked his clothes and skin, and his hands were raw from rescuing animals. But it was the look in his eyes that broke Sarah's heart, pure desolation as he surveyed the wreckage of all they'd built. The banker's revenge had struck true, turning triumph to ashes in a single night. As the first pale light of dawn crept over the horizon, it illuminated only devastation where their barn had stood, and the long shadow of despair across Gary's face. Sarah moved to stand beside him, her own heart heavy with grief. All around them, the ranch hands slumped in exhaustion, faces grim with the knowledge that they'd only saved a portion of their stock. The night's victory at the courthouse felt distant now, overshadowed by this cruel retaliation. The smoke continued to rise in the growing light, a dark column marking their loss against the brightening sky. They stood together in silence, watching hope burn away with the last of the embers. Dawn crept over the ranch like a gray shroud. The morning air hung thick with smoke and the acrid stench of burned timber. Wisps of steam rose from the ruins, where Jesse had thrown water on hot spots through the night. The surviving cattle huddled in the far pasture, their coughs echoing across the yard, lungs irritated by the smoke that still clung to everything. Sarah stood at the kitchen window, a cup of cold coffee forgotten in her hands. The devastation looked even worse in daylight. Charred beams jutted from ash piles like broken bones. Patches of scorched earth marked where burning debris had scattered. The pride they'd felt just yesterday at the courthouse seemed cruel now. A brief joy crushed under the banker's revenge. Through the window, she watched Hank and Billy approach the ruins with shovels, ready to start clearing debris. Their movements were slow, weighted with exhaustion from the night's battle against the flames. Jesse joined them. Leading a horse laden with water barrels, they'd need to keep dousing hot spots to prevent any chance of rekindling. Gary emerged from the house, his boots heavy on the porch boards. He hadn't slept. Sarah had heard him pacing all night. Now he stood rigid, staring at the destruction. The morning light revealed fresh lines carved into his face, aging him years in a single night. "Leave it," his voice cracked across the yard like a whip. "Just leave it be." The hands paused, exchanging uncertain glances. "But boss," Jesse started, "we ought to." "I said leave it." Gary's shout made them all flinch. He strode into the yard, rage radiating from every movement. Ain't no point cleaning up ashes when everything worth saving is already gone. Sarah set down her coffee cup with trembling hands and stepped onto the porch. Gary, please, let them help. We need to, he whirled on her, eyes blazing. We need. To what? Pretend this ain't your fault? The accusation struck like a physical blow. Sarah stepped back, her hand flying to her throat. All your fine papers and court victories, Gary continued, bitter words spilling out like poison. Look what they brought us. My barn in ashes, half my stock either dead or sickened. Everything I spent years building, gone in one night because you had to push for your precious inheritance. I never meant, Sarah's voice quavered. Meant don't matter none now, does it? Gary kicked a chunk of charred wood, sending it spinning. Should have known better than to get mixed up in your fight with the banker. Should have left well enough alone instead of letting you drag us all into your mess. The ranch hands stood frozen, faces uncomfortable. Billy started to speak up, but Hank grabbed his arm, shaking his head slightly. Sarah felt tears burning her eyes but refused to let them fall. She lifted her chin, summoning what dignity she could. I'll be inside if you need me, she said quietly, turning away from Gary's anger. The day crawled by in bitter silence. Sarah moved through her usual tasks, mechanically feeding the hands, tending the kitchen garden, gathering eggs from the few chickens that hadn't fled during the fire. But every movement felt hollow, weighted with Gary's accusations. He spent the day stalking the property like a wounded bear, snapping at anyone who came near. The hands kept their distance, working unnecessary chores far from the house. Even the dog slunk away from his dark mood. As afternoon faded toward evening, Sarah stood in their bedroom, hands trembling as she folded clothes into her small valise. She packed only what she'd brought originally, her second dress, her mother's Bible, the photograph of her father. The inheritance papers she left carefully stacked on Gary's desk. They'd brought nothing but grief. In the end, dusk painted the sky in mournful purples when Sarah finally walked downstairs, valise in hand. Gary sat at the kitchen table, staring into nothing, a cold cup of coffee before him. He didn't look up as she entered. I cannot stay where I'm not wanted, Sarah said softly, her voice steady despite the ache in her heart. I'll not burden you with my presence or my troubles any longer. She waited, hoping against hope that he would speak, would ask her to stay, would show some sign that his anger had cooled. But Gary remained silent, his jaw clenched tight, pride and pain holding back any words that might have bridged the gulf between them. Sarah nodded once, accepting his silence as final answer. God be with you, Gary Hawley, she whispered, and walked out the front door. The evening air had cooled, carrying the lingering scent of smoke. Sarah paused on the porch, taking one last look at the place she'd briefly called home, the garden she'd tended, the chair where she'd sat mending, the spot where she and Gary had stood just yesterday, full of hope for their future. Then she squared her shoulders and started walking. The road to town stretched before her, a pale ribbon in the failing light. She didn't look back to see if Gary watched her go. Her footsteps crunched softly in the dirt, each one carrying her further from the dream she'd built here. Behind her, Gary stood in the doorway, his hands gripping the frame so hard his knuckles showed white. Every fiber of his being screamed to call her back, to apologize, to admit his anger came from fear and loss rather than true blame. But pride held his tongue prisoner, choking back words that might have saved them both. He watched until Sarah's figure disappeared into the gathering darkness. Only then did he move, walking with heavy steps to the ruins of the barn. He sank down amid the ashes, surrounded by the wreckage of all he'd lost. Lord, he whispered, his voice rough with unshed tears, I ain't prayed proper in years, not since Mary died. Reckoned you turned your back on me then. He picked up a handful of ash, letting it sift through his fingers. But I'm asking now, asking for forgiveness, for strength, his voice broke, for wisdom to know how to make this right. No answer came except the evening wind, stirring the ashes around him. Gary bowed his head, alone in the growing night, the weight of his own bitter words pressing down like stones on his heart. The ranch settled into darkness, silent except for the occasional cough of smoke-stressed cattle and the distant cry of a coyote. In the bunkhouse, the hands pretended not to hear their boss's ragged breathing as he grieved amid the ruins of his barn and perhaps Something even more precious. Sarah stumbled into Clear Fork as morning sunlight crept over the dusty streets. Her feet ached from walking all night and weariness dragged at her bones. The white-painted church beckoned like a beacon of hope. Preacher Thompson opened the door before she could knock. "My dear child," he said softly, noting her exhausted state. Come in, come in." He led her to the kitchen where his wife already had coffee brewing and biscuits warming. That evening, Sarah sat among the women's prayer circle, her story spilling. Out between quiet sobs, Mrs. Thompson held her hand while others gathered close. "You're no reject," Mrs. Miller declared firmly. "The Lord chose you special, same as He chose Queen Esther. Your trials have purpose." Meanwhile at the ranch, Gary stared unseeing at his supper until Hank slammed his cup down. "Boss, you're a fool. That woman saved our stock twice over. Worked harder than any of us." Jessie nodded. "She brought life back here, and faith too." Later, Gary knelt by his cold bed, tears finally breaking free. "Lord," he whispered, "I've been running since Mary died. Help me find my way back. Help me make this right. It's right." Dawn painted the sky in gentle pinks as Gary hitched his team to the wagon. Every creak of leather reminded him of his shame, but determination drove him forward. The morning air held a crisp promise as he guided his horses into Clear Fork. Found Sarah in the churchyard, her broom whisking dust from the wooden steps. The sight of her stopped his breath. Removing his hat, he stepped forward, boots scuffing the dirt. "Sarah," he said, voice rough, "I was wrong, plain wrong. Grief and anger blinded me something fierce." Sarah's eyes welled with tears. "I nearly lost hope," she whispered. "But I knew God sent me here for purpose." Their hands met, fingers intertwining. The preacher emerged, nodding approval. Together, they sent word through town. By noon, the meeting hall filled weathered farmers, stern-faced ranch wives, even Two Hawks and his people from the settlement. One by one, they rose. Tales of the banker's schemes poured forth like a cleansing rain. The banker's face reddened as Sheriff Dillard stepped forward, iron cuffs gleaming. Weeks later, the sound of hammering and sawing filled the morning air. Wagons creaked into the ranch yard, loaded with fresh-cut lumber. Children darted between workers, clutching handfuls of nails, their laughter mixing with the rhythm of work. The scent of sawdust mingled with the aroma of Sarah's cooking wafting from the kitchen window. Fresh bread and stew. Sarah called, and hungry workers lined up eagerly. Gary paused in raising the barn frame, wiping sweat from his brow. His gaze followed Sarah as she moved among the workers, serving bowls with a warm smile. As dusk settled, lanterns cast golden light across the yard. Families gathered around a crackling bonfire, and hymn-singing rose into the star-filled sky. Gary stood, drawing Sarah close before the assembled crowd. "The Lord sent me an answer to prayer," he declared, his voice thick with emotion. "Not just a wife, a true partner." Tears traced down Sarah's cheeks as children danced in the firelight. She and Gary stood hand in hand, watching their restored ranch and community thrive, living proof that God's grace turns rejection into blessing. If something in this story whispered to your spirit, stay a while. Subscribe and come back tomorrow. The next story may be the one you didn't know you needed.